Israel is undergoing a very, I think, fast and worrying process of getting to be more and more authoritarian, even fascist in a way. Now, I'm saying that knowing that Israel was always like that in regard to its treatment to Palestinians.
I'm Fatima Bhutto, and this is Reframe, where we seek new conversations and perspectives. In this series, we'll be discussing one of the most consequential issues of our time, the war in Gaza and Israel's military conduct. My guest this week is Yuli Novak, a prominent political activist from Israel. For 5 years, Yuli led Breaking the Silence, an organization of IDF veterans speaking out against the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, she's the executive director of B'Tselem, one of the leading Israeli human rights organizations. Because of her work, Yuli's been labeled a threat to the state of Israel. Yuli, thank you so much for joining us today. Your grandparents are Holocaust survivors, and your grandfather was a member of Irgun, the Zionist militia. And you yourself grew up as a Zionist. And I wonder what Zionism means to you today. Is it the same Zionism of your childhood?
So first of all, thank you for having me. And it's a good question, but probably one of the most complex questions for me to answer. So yeah, I grew up, and you said about my grandparents, I have another grandmother who came from Morocco. Her family came from Egypt and then to Hebron in Palestine. And yeah, I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the center of Israel, in a very Zionist, but also very liberal and open and free environment. Zionism for me was first and foremost, I think, a feeling and not a political concept.
An emotional concept?
An emotional concept, something that had to do with identity and not necessarily a political identity. Zionism was something that symbolized life for me. Because, as you said, that's what brought my grandparents to Israel, and that's what became to be my family, right? So, for me, Zionism growing up was mostly a love for my country, a love for the land, and a strong commitment to it. And I used to think of Israel as a place and a country that I can be very proud of. And saying that, I was also a leftist. Because in Israel, or the concept of left is usually in regard to how you look at and how you understand the occupation, what we call 67 occupation. The West Bank and Gaza and the military occupation of Israel over that territory. And I grew up to know that we're doing something very wrong there by holding these territories, but still it was a matter of policy. So for me, I was living in a democracy, and there is this temporary policy of occupation that need to be changed. So we need to vote and to elect a government that will change this policy. And that was my Zionism. Throughout the years, I learned that there was a big part that was missing out of this story.
What was missing?
If you are not telling the whole story, it's actually false. Because I never thought of Zionism as a political movement that created down the line the regime of apartheid and occupation and colonialism. I never thought about the fact that this movement that brought my grandparents to Israel is actually the same movement that deny this right from other people who live there. So in that sense, it was quite a long journey for me to unlearn Zionism. but it is still not an easy thing to do.
You led the NGO Breaking the Silence, which published a report on the 2014 war in Gaza. And it was at this time that you've said your soul began to crack. Can you tell us about what Breaking the Silence was? And also, what did that report expose?
Yeah, so Breaking the Silence is an Israeli organization of ex-soldiers collecting testimonies of soldiers and publish them in order to shed light of the immorality of the Israeli military occupation over the West Bank and Gaza. In 2014, there was a massive campaign, military campaign in Gaza, Israeli military campaign. And that wasn't new, but it was the first time for me that I was part of an organization that investigates the army conducts. And what we figured out quite quickly and was very shocking to me is that the human price tag of that campaign, which back then was unthinkable. We're talking about 50 days of fighting, over 2,000 people killed, over 500 children killed, mass destruction. You know, talking about this today, it feels like...
Yeah.
But back then, it was the first time I understood that what I'm seeing, what I'm looking at, is not, you know, what Israel and what the Israeli army calls collateral damage, is not something that was done by mistake. But the shocking thing to me was, first, to understand that. Second, this understanding stood in very stark contradiction to everything I knew about the Israeli army and about my country. And third, that was the first time where I felt, I think, a very stark gap between me and people around me.
You served in the Israeli army, and you served 5 years, so you were there longer than the compulsory service. But through your time with the IDF and also with Breaking the Silence and dealing with soldiers, I wonder what you make of what we have been seeing over this past year and several months. This set of photos and videos of Israeli soldiers blowing up homes and schools. And beyond that, the soldiers dressing up in women's lingerie and clothing. Is that something as well that has been a shock and a break from what you grew up believing?
Of course.
I mean, it's not been seen before, has it? This kind of...
I think in general, what we are seeing and facing during the last year, I have to say there is nothing new, except of the scale of things and kind of the crudeness of it. You know, there was, I think for Israelis, for soldiers, but for Israelis in general, and also for Israeli leaders and politicians, there was, throughout the years, kind of, it was very clear that there is a need and want to create this facade, at least a facade of a democracy, of something that has a respect for human rights and for humans in general. And that, I think, something that we're, I don't know if completely lost, but it's kind of been taken away from my society. And if you talk about the Israeli soldiers' conduct, you have to put it into context. And the context is now the ongoing dehumanization of the Palestinian people that is taking place throughout the past year in Israel. And that starts from the top. You probably remember just the days after the war started, Netanyahu, our prime minister, stood there and talked to the soldiers going out to Gaza and told them, "Zechor et asher asa lecha Amalek." Yani, remember what Amalek did to you. Now, that is a dog whistle to every Israeli, because all of us learned in school what Amalek did to us and what was needed and ordered by God to do to Amalek, and that is to kill everybody, not to leave anyone behind. And that is just one example, right? Because our Ministry of Defense a few days later said we're fighting animals and we need to treat them as such. But, you know, the ongoing public discourse in Israel, even mainstream, very mainstream media, is basically talking about there are no civilians and there are no innocent people in Gaza. So just when you think about this sentiment and take into account that the Israeli public is really traumatized from the events and the attack of October 7th, put this together and you get a very, I think, cruel and violent outcome.
I want to talk to you a bit more about society and what it's gone through. The majority of Israelis do support the war in Gaza. And you've said that society is so right-wing since October the 7th that protests to bring the hostages home are now considered a left-wing issue. Where do you see this going?
Israel is undergoing a very, I think, fast and worrying and scary process of getting to be more and more authoritarian, even fascist in a way. Now I'm saying that knowing that Israel was always like that in regard to its treatment to Palestinians, right? But again, all of us grew up knowing that we live in democracy. For some of us, like me, at one point we realized that it cannot be a democracy if it's only democracy for half of the people who live under the control of this regime. And what we're seeing today is a process of Israel becoming more and more oppressive, also towards its privileged group. And, you know, talking about the hostages and the hostages' families who are becoming a target of the government, only for calling for the most basic thing, and that is do whatever you can to make sure that those people who randomly were kidnapped in a criminal way and are still held in Gaza, do whatever you can to bring them back. And just because it doesn't stand in line with the political agenda and the political interest of our government, they're being marked also as traitors, also as kind of enemy of the state, and they're being attacked the same way as any other element in Israel that is critical of our government. And that is, you know, that's a process that is not unique to Israel, right? It's something that we see in many countries. But in our specific case, it is even more worrying than other places because the first victims of this process are again Palestinians. And I see a link between the attitude towards Jewish Israelis who are opposing even the policies of the government, not the basic principles of it, and the conducts of the Israeli army in Gaza and also in the West Bank.
You've personally faced attacks for your human rights work from the time of breaking the silence. And now you're the executive director of B'Tselem. And B'Tselem recently released a report titled Welcome to Hell about the abuse and torture of Palestinians held in Israeli custody since October 7th. Can you tell us what your findings revealed?
B'Tselem is an Israeli organization, but our team, our staff are both Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Some of them from the West Bank, some of them from the Gaza Strip, and some of them live inside the Green Line. We thought we're going to hear about, you know, sporadic cases of violence, of abuse. And what we heard was shocking because we collected more than 50 testimonies of people who were held in 16 different facilities, some of them military facilities like Sde Taiman, but some of them civil prisons. And they were all telling the same story about ongoing harsh abuse physical and mental, on a daily basis. People are being beaten up, starved, denied of medical treatment. The shocking thing about it was that when you hear it so many times, you understand that it is actually a policy, especially when we take into account that the person who the Israeli government put in charge of the prison system is Itamar Ben-Gvir, the most far-right politician that Israel ever had. After working on this report and writing it down, we understood that we also need to name things as they are. And that it is our responsibility when we're talking about speaking truth to power, even if they are released a day after with no charges, which applies to 50 out of 55 witnesses, right? They were all released with no charges. You will be a victim of torture. We decided that that's a place that needs to be called a torture camp and not a prison.
We're going to turn, Yuli, now to the audience, who I know have questions that they'd very much like to pose to you. Over here, we've got a question.
So my name is Jeffrey Newman. I'm a rabbi in London. First, I feel so proud to be here with you, with your courage. You've touched on the sacrifices that you and the staff are having to make, but a little bit more about that I would be interested in hearing.
You know, it's hard for me to answer about the sacrifices because there are a lot, but I think everyone, Israelis and Palestinians who live today in Israel, Palestine, pay a huge price for living under this oppressive regime. And I'm not trying to make a symmetry between the price that is paid by the oppressed, by the Palestinian, and by the one that cast as superior, us the Jews. But, you know, it's not only sacrifice, because I also feel very privileged at the moment to be able to work with Palestinians, to see something true that many people in my society and many Israelis are completely blind to, not because they are bad people, just because this is a characteristic of oppressive regime and apartheid regime, is to make you blind, to make you not see.
Other questions for Yuli? Yeah, over here.
So we hear a lot of reports of IDF soldiers refusing to join the army, and some of them also leaving the IDF. Are you able to give an idea of how big Breaking the Silence movement is, and how many of the IDF soldiers are awakening to the crimes that they're committing at the moment? And just one more is, what was the tipping point for you that made you flip?
Breaking the Silence is not an organization of refusnik, and actually the numbers of Israeli soldiers who refuse to serve under moral or consciousness reasons is very small. We're talking about a few dozens every year. And I think that also has to do with the system that we're growing up in, and this very strong belief that you have as an Israeli, and I know because I had it too, that we have no choice. That the only thing that will keep Israelis safe is to oppress Palestinians, is to keep this ongoing, endless war going. I mean, it puts all of us in risk. So again, I have this moral stand, ethical stand, that has nothing to do with me being an Israeli, but I have also a very clear interest of not living under this regime.
Other questions? Yeah?
So Isaac Chotner from The New Yorker recently interviewed Israeli writer Yossi Klein Halevi, who served in the IDF. A line that really stood out was, in Israel, we know the IDF because we are the IDF. how much do you think this identification of Israelis with the IDF informs some people's views that there are no innocent civilians in Gaza?
It's interesting, but I'm not sure there is a connection between the two. I completely agree with this notion. I mean, Israel society is a hyper-militaristic society. From when I was a very, very small child, to be proud of the Israeli army, to identify with it. We heard about people who refuse and asked about that. You need to be very knowledgeable and very brave at the age of 18 in order to refuse to take part in it. Unfortunately, I wasn't. And in that sense, yeah, there is kind of equivalent between the IDF is us in a way, and the identification with the Israeli army is there. But I think what we see, or this attitude toward Gazans and toward Palestinians in general, derived from the dehumanization of a whole group of people. That's the essence of apartheid, in a sense, is to make, in a very sophisticated way, make you believe that this separation, that this dividedness is something that is logical because we are really different in essence. Combine that with the basic knowledge of or feeling of persecution because of the Holocaust, because of the history of the real history of the Jewish people. The outcome of it is I think the creation of a very cruel thing, but people that are almost can't see suffering of the other.
Yuli, you've written in your memoir that for you, the political struggle was incomplete without a personal struggle. You become a mother quite recently. And I wonder what the process of becoming a mother has changed in terms of your hopes and your fears for the future.
Yeah, so I did become a mother. I have a beautiful baby boy. When he was 10 days old, we had to run for the shelter for the first time. It was the morning of October 7. And since then, countless times. And you know, it's a big dissonance, massive dissonance. Because when I'm holding him, sitting in a shelter, I remember that most babies and children don't have shelter to run to and don't hear a siren before a rocket is thrown at them. And then I look in his eyes, and it's just the most adorable thing, and you have to smile back, right? So I hope for him to grow up in a very different place than I did. I know it's a big dream, but a place that holds the values that I believed my country is about, of generosity and kindness and justice. And he will learn truth about his life, about who he is. I really hope that he wouldn't need to unlearn things and he wouldn't feel lied to like I am. And I wish that for him, but more than that, I just wish that for every child in Israel, Palestine.
And really, every child everywhere would be lucky to have that kind of future. Thank you so much, Yuli Novak, for being here on Reframe. And thank you to our audience in London for joining us today.